Back to our phone callers. Vinny next, listening in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Hi, Vinny.
How you doing, Hank?
Doing well, thank you.
I have a question about Matthew 24, when the apostles asked Jesus, when will the end come? And Jesus says these several things, and then he says, when the gospel will be preached in all the world, then shall the end come. Is he referring to this time where we have TV and radio stations and towers and wind-up radios and the internet and preaching the gospel in all the world? Or is he referring to the part in Revelations where these two people, I don't remember if they're people or angels, that God chooses, and they go around and preach the gospel in all the world, and some people laugh at them, and they have the power to kill them and send plagues out against them, and then they are killed, and 3.5 days later they're seen rising up into heaven. Is Jesus talking about those two people in Revelation preaching the gospel in all the world, then shall the end come? Or is he talking about now when we have the internet and all these, and we're trying to do all this outreach now?
Yeah, well, that's a false choice because Jesus is speaking about neither. And by the way, the two witnesses that you allude to in Revelation are a metaphorical reference to Moses and Elijah. Remember, in the Old Testament jurisprudence, there was a mandate for at least two witnesses to convict of a crime. And in this case, the two witnesses accuse Israel of apostasy. The imagery, of course, is very common in the Old Testament, and I point this out in a number of different places, including the Complete Bible Answer Book Collector's Edition. The mission of those two witnesses was rightly identified with the person and work of Jesus Christ because, like Jesus, they're sacrificial lambs. And not only so, but their resurrection after 3.5 days parallels the resurrection of Christ in much the same way that their 3.5-year ministry mirrors that of Messiah. And the fact that they're clothed in sackcloth, as we see in Revelation 11, identifies them with a tradition of Hebrew prophets from Elijah to John the Baptist, who wore sackcloth in mourning over the apostasy of Israel. So what's going on with the two witnesses cannot be interpreted unless you understand the imagery from a Old Testament perspective. So in light of the Old Testament, the two witnesses are revealed not as two literal people, not a future reincarnation of Moses and Elijah, but rather as literary characters in an apocalyptic narrative representing the entire line of Hebrew prophets in testifying against Israel and warning of soon coming judgment of God on the city of Jerusalem. Now, that's precisely what's going on as well in Matthew chapter 24. If you read Matthew chapter 24, you have to read it within its intended context, and then you find out the question that Jesus is answering. He's left the temple, he's walking away from the temple, and then his disciples come to him and they ask him, "Do you see all these things?" Speaking, of course, of the temple. And Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another, every one will be thrown down." Well, later on, Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples come to him privately, and they wonder, when is that going to happen? In other words, when is the temple, when is Jerusalem going to be destroyed? And Jesus then gives them an answer to that question. So the question they are asking is not about the end of the world, but the end of the age of temple, priest, and sacrifice, the end of Jerusalem as they knew it. And then Jesus begins explaining to them that that's not going to happen until the gospel has been preached throughout the Roman Empire. So when you read things like, "and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations," it's talking about the inhabited earth or the Roman Empire. And we have ample evidence for that because throughout the New Testament we have apostles like Paul saying the gospel has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, or saying all over the world the gospel is bearing fruit. Obviously, he again is talking about the inhabited earth. We have the same thing in Acts 24, where Paul is stirring up riots all over the world, or Acts chapter 2, where you have Jews from every nation under heaven in Jerusalem. So my point here is to say that context is very important in answering the first part of the question that you asked, but it's also very important in demonstrating that the two witnesses are not in view in the sense that you are talking about. They're in view in the sense that there will be the witness of the entire cadre of Hebrew prophets that testify against the apostasy of Israel, because Israel, instead of being a light to the nations as she was called to be, Jerusalem, instead of being a golden city on a hill, a light to the nations, has instead apostatized herself with the nations. And that's why throughout the Old Testament, she's called a harlot or a prostitute. And so she has aligned herself with Rome as opposed to aligning herself with Christ. And she has denied Messiah in her midst. And as a result, temple, priest, and sacrifice forever will be dispelled because they failed to recognize the substance or the fulfillment of the temple, priest, and sacrifice in their midst.
I was way off.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people are, and the reason is they've heard the text interpreted without a context, and that's why it's important to learn how to read the Bible for all it's worth, and that's one of the purposes behind writing the Apocalypse Code. It's to give you the art and science of biblical interpretation in such a way that you can grasp it and then apply it. Because otherwise what happens is you end up reading the New Testament with a newspaper in your hand as opposed to reading the New Testament through the magnifying lens of the apostles and prophets.